Henrik Voss lay on his belly in absolute darkness, crawling through a tunnel of ice beneath 4 feet of snow, while the blizzard above howled loud enough to shake the frozen walls around him. In his arms, 3 bundled logs scraped against the smooth ceiling as he pulled himself forward, breathing the cold air that somehow still carried warmth from the cabin he'd left behind 30 seconds ago. Before we go further, let us know in the comments what kind of winter you're facing this year, and if stories of frontier survival engineering speak to you. Hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. Henrik Voss had survived 11 winters in the Montana Territory by 1842, trapping beaver and marten along the tributaries that fed into the Jefferson River. He was 31 years old, methodical, and careful in ways that kept men alive in country that killed the careless with efficient brutality. His cabin sat on a low ridge above a creek, positioned to catch southern sun exposure and avoid the worst of the valley winds. The structure was solid, built with the same precision he applied to everything: chinked logs, proper fireplace, elevated sleeping platform, and a woodpile stacked against the north wall outside, protected from prevailing weather by the cabin itself. The woodpile was 15 feet from his door. On a clear day, the walk took 5 seconds. During a storm, it might take 30 seconds of cold exposure to retrieve an armload of split logs. This arrangement was standard among trappers and settlers across the territory. Keep your wood close, keep it dry, and accept that winter meant regular trips outside to maintain your fire. Most men didn't think twice about it. Henrik had stopped thinking about much else since January of 1842. That month, he had been visiting Thomas Garrett's cabin 12 miles upriver. Thomas was a friend, an occasional trapping partner, an English immigrant who had come west 5 years earlier with dreams of fortune and freedom. His cabin was typical of the region, perhaps slightly better built than most. Thomas had invited Henrik to wait out a storm front that was moving down from the north, bringing the kind of weather that made travel dangerous. They spent 2 days inside while snow fell steadily, talking about trap lines and spring plans, burning through Thomas's woodpile at a steady rate. On the second night, the wind increased to genuine blizzard conditions. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to arm's length. The temperature plummeted to what Henrik estimated was 30 below zero, maybe colder. Thomas's fire burned low around midnight. He announced he was going outside to get more wood. His woodpile, like Henrik's, sat against the cabin's exterior wall less than 20 feet from the door. Henrik offered to go with him, but Thomas waved him off. It was a simple task. He'd be back in a minute. Thomas opened the door into a wall of wind and snow that extinguished 2 candles immediately. He stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him. Henrik waited by the fire, feeding it the last few pieces of wood from the interior supply. 1 minute passed, then 2. By 3 minutes, Henrik felt the first stirring of concern. At 5 minutes, he knew something was wrong. He grabbed his coat and opened the door into conditions that shocked him despite 11 winters of experience. The wind hit with physical force, and the snow was so thick he couldn't see the woodpile that he knew stood less than 20 feet away. Henrik pushed into the blizzard with one hand on the cabin wall, using it as a guide. The wind screamed past his ears, loud enough to drown out his own shouting. He called Thomas's name repeatedly, knowing the sound wouldn't carry 5 feet in these conditions. Snow stung his exposed skin like thrown sand. The cold burned in his lungs with each breath. He moved along the wall toward where the woodpile should be, counting steps to maintain orientation. At 10 steps, he should have reached the corner where the woodpile began. He found nothing but empty space and driving snow. Henrik extended his search pattern, moving away from the wall in careful increments, always keeping one reference point. His boot struck something solid after 3 steps into the open. He dropped to his knees and found Thomas lying face down in snow that was already drifting over him. Henrik grabbed his friend's coat and pulled. Thomas's body moved with the terrible limpness of dead weight. Henrik dragged him back toward the cabin, fighting wind that seemed determined to push them off course. He found the wall more by luck than navigation, then hauled Thomas along its length until he located the door. Getting inside took 3 attempts. The wind kept slamming the door shut. When Henrik finally managed to drag both himself and Thomas across the threshold, he knew his friend was already gone. Thomas's skin was gray-white. Ice crystals had formed in his beard and eyebrows. His hands were bare, mittens lost somewhere in the storm. Henrik pulled him close to the fire anyway, checking for any sign of breathing, any hint of warmth. There was nothing. Thomas Garrett had frozen to death less than 20 feet from his own door, probably within minutes of stepping outside. Henrik wrapped him in blankets and spent the rest of the night feeding the fire with wood from Thomas's indoor supply, keeping watch over a body that no longer needed warmth. Morning brought calmer winds and the gray light of continued snowfall. Henrik stepped outside to understand what had happened. The story was written in confused tracks that the new snow hadn't yet completely buried. Thomas had left the door and turned left instead of right. He'd walked parallel to the cabin wall for 15 feet, then apparently realized his mistake and turned back. But the whiteout conditions had disoriented him completely. His tracks showed him circling, backtracking, moving in directions that made no sense. He'd exhausted himself trying to find either the door or the woodpile, both of which were within a few steps during his entire ordeal. The woodpile stood untouched 12 feet from where Thomas had finally collapsed. The cabin door was 8 feet in another direction. Henrik could see both from where he stood. In clear morning light, the distances seemed absurdly small, 20 feet total. Thomas had died because he couldn't navigate 20 feet in a blizzard. Henrik began digging a grave on the hillside behind the cabin, and with each shovel of frozen earth, a single thought crystallized in his mind. 20 feet should not be a death sentence. Henrik returned to his own cabin 3 days later, after burying Thomas on a hillside overlooking the creek they'd both trapped. The journey back took twice as long as usual. He kept stopping to stare at his surroundings, seeing the landscape differently now. Every isolated cabin he passed represented the same fatal flaw. A door, a woodpile nearby, an empty space between them that became a death trap when conditions turned severe. Back at his own place, Henrik couldn't settle into normal routine. He stood in his doorway repeatedly, measuring the 15 feet to his woodpile with his eyes. On clear days, the distance seemed trivial. He could make the trip with his eyes closed. But he remembered the whiteout conditions at Thomas's cabin, remembered how complete disorientation had come within seconds of stepping outside. 15 feet or 50 feet made no difference when you couldn't see your own hands in front of your face. He studied the problem from every angle. Some trappers ran ropes between their doors and woodpiles, using them as guidelines during storms. Henrik had seen these rope systems. They worked adequately in moderate weather, but failed during serious blizzards. Ice built up on the ropes, making them thick and brittle. The weight of accumulated ice combined with wind stress snapped them like dry twigs. He'd heard of men who grabbed for their guide rope during a storm only to have it break in their hands, leaving them disoriented and doomed. Other trappers stacked enormous quantities of wood inside their cabins before winter, enough to last weeks or even months. This approach worked if you had the interior space and didn't mind living in what amounted to a wood storage shed. Most cabins were barely large enough for a man and his essential supplies. Filling half the interior with firewood meant sacrificing living space for the entire winter. It also created fire hazards, and mice loved woodpiles. Henrik had visited cabins where men lived, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling stacked wood, breathing air thick with bark dust and mouse droppings. Spring came, and Henrik traveled more than usual, visiting other trappers under the pretense of checking trap lines and trading supplies. Really, he was investigating winter wood access methods. The stories he heard troubled him. William Crawford described rationing wood during a week-long storm, keeping his fire barely alive to stretch his indoor supply. Lars Nordquist admitted he'd considered burning his table and chairs rather than risk going outside during a particularly brutal February blizzard. Duncan MacLeod told of a trapper found dead in his cabin 2 winters back, frozen with an empty firebox while his untouched woodpile sat outside. The frontier community accepted this reality without much complaint. Winter killed people. Sometimes it killed them in ways that seemed unfair or absurd, but that was the nature of the country. You accepted the risks or you went back east. Henrik understood this philosophy. He'd lived by it for 11 years. But Thomas's death had changed something fundamental in how he saw the problem. Every evening that spring and summer, he sat by his fire with a piece of charcoal and flat pieces of bark, sketching ideas that mostly led nowhere. Henrik had grown up near Freiburg in southwestern Germany, in country where silver mines had operated for centuries. His father had worked underground for 20 years, coming home each evening with stories of tunnels that stretched miles into mountain hearts. Henrik remembered one detail his father repeated often. In the deepest winter, when snow buried the mining village under drifts that reached second-story windows, the mine entrances remained clear. Tunnels stayed passable regardless of surface conditions. Men walked to work underground while the world above disappeared under snow and ice. His grandmother had maintained a root cellar beneath her house, accessed through a trapdoor in her kitchen floor. Stone steps led down to a chamber where she stored vegetables, preserved meats, and barrels of salted fish. Henrik remembered following her down those steps as a child, watching her retrieve food in any weather without stepping outside. Winter storms that kept everyone else trapped indoors meant nothing to her. She simply opened her kitchen floor and walked underground to her supplies. These memories crystallized into possibility during a July evening in 1842. Henrik sat outside his cabin watching the sun set behind western peaks, thinking about Thomas, about winter, about the impossible problem of safely crossing 15 feet during a blizzard. The mine tunnels and his grandmother's root cellar merged in his mind. What if the solution wasn't finding a better way to travel above ground, but eliminating surface travel entirely? He could dig a tunnel from inside his cabin to his woodpile location. The concept seemed radical, but structurally sound. Miners worked underground year-round. Root cellars functioned through every season. A tunnel between his cabin and woodpile would remain passable regardless of snow depth or wind conditions. He'd never be exposed to the elements. The distance was shorter than the typical root cellar passage his grandmother had used for 30 years. The engineering challenges began revealing themselves immediately. A simple dirt tunnel would collapse under snow weight. Mountain snow could accumulate to depths of 5 or 6 feet, weighing tons per square yard. The tunnel would need structural support. Timber reinforcement was possible, but would require enormous quantities of wood. He'd need to cut, haul, and install support beams along the entire length. Stone lining would be even more labor-intensive, possibly taking an entire season to complete. Henrik considered these problems for weeks, making calculations on his bark sheets, sketching cross-sections of different tunnel designs. Then a different possibility occurred to him. What if he didn't reinforce the tunnel with imported materials? What if he used something abundant, free, and naturally occurring in winter conditions? Ice formed thick layers on the creek every winter, strong enough to support a man's weight by December, strong enough to support a horse by January. Ice was stone-hard at Montana temperatures. Ice was waterproof. Ice was available in unlimited quantities. The question wasn't whether ice could provide structural support. The question was whether he could intentionally create an ice-reinforced tunnel that would maintain stability through an entire winter. Henrik began planning experiments. Henrik spent the spring and summer of 1842 conducting experiments in shaded areas where ground stayed cold and damp. He dug test tunnels, each one teaching him something about what worked and what failed. His first attempt used a simple rectangular cross-section, the easiest shape to excavate. He cut straight walls and a flat ceiling, then applied water to the surfaces and waited for freezing temperatures at night. The ice formed adequately, creating a hard shell over the dirt walls. He tested the structure by piling rocks and logs on top, simulating snow weight. The ceiling cracked within hours. The corners fractured where walls met ceiling, and the entire structure showed stress failures along every joint. A rectangular tunnel might work with timber reinforcement, but ice alone couldn't handle the load distribution. The right angles created concentration points where force exceeded the ice's structural capacity. His second attempt used a fully rounded cross-section, like a tube lying on its side. He spent days carefully shaping the curve, creating a uniform arch from floor to ceiling. This design distributed weight far better. When he applied ice and tested it with simulated loads, the structure held without cracking, but the rounded tunnel presented serious practical problems. It was extremely difficult to excavate evenly, and crawling through it would be awkward. The curved floor made transporting anything while crawling nearly impossible. Henrik sat beside his failed experiments and thought about what he'd learned. Flat ceilings distributed weight evenly across their span, but created stress at corners. Curved surfaces eliminated stress concentration, but were impractical for use. He needed to combine the advantages of both while eliminating the weaknesses of each. The solution came to him while watching water flow in the creek. The creek bed was flat on top where it met the banks, but curved at the bottom where water had worn the stone smooth. He dug a new test tunnel with a flat ceiling and a rounded, scooped-out floor. The cross-section resembled a rectangle sitting on top of a half-circle. The flat roof maintained consistent headroom for crawling. The curved floor eliminated corner stress points and created a natural channel at the center. He shaped the surfaces carefully, making them as smooth as possible. Then began the ice application process. He hauled buckets of water from the creek in the evening when temperatures dropped. Using a brush made from pine boughs, he painted thin layers on the tunnel walls and ceiling. Each layer froze overnight. The next evening, he added another layer. He built the ice thickness gradually over 2 weeks, creating a laminated structure where each layer bonded to the previous one. The final thickness reached 3 inches on the ceiling and walls. When he tested this design with heavy loads placed on the surface above, the tunnel held perfectly. No cracks appeared. No settling occurred. The flat over curved shape distributed forces exactly as he'd hoped. Henrik had found his solution. Now he needed to build the real version before winter arrived. Henrik began excavation in early September of 1842, giving himself 3 months before serious winter arrived. He measured the distance from his cabin's north wall to the spot where his woodpile stood, 23 feet in a straight line. He would dig 4 feet deep to get below the frost line, then tunnel horizontally at that depth, emerging directly beneath where his woodpile would be relocated. He started inside the cabin, removing a section of floor planks near the north wall. The entrance shaft went straight down, 4 feet through packed earth and clay. He worked in the confined space with a narrow spade, hauling dirt out in a leather bucket. Once he reached proper depth, he began the horizontal tunnel, maintaining the precise dimensions his experiments had proven successful. The ceiling stayed flat, exactly 2 feet 6 inches above the lowest point of the curved floor. The width measured 2 feet 4 inches, enough for his shoulders with minimal clearance on each side. Excavating the tunnel was brutally hard work. He lay on his side or belly, digging forward inches at a time, then backing out, dragging buckets of loose earth. The confined space made every movement awkward. Swinging a tool with any force was impossible. He scraped and pried and scooped, removing the earth in small quantities because there was no room to work any other way. Some days he managed 3 feet of progress. Other days he barely advanced 2 feet before exhaustion forced him to stop. He worked alone, telling no one what he was doing. Lars Nordquist stopped by in late September and asked about the dirt pile beside Henrik's cabin. Henrik said he was digging a root cellar, which was close enough to the truth that Lars accepted it without further questions. The work continued through October. Henrik's hands developed thick calluses. His shoulders ached constantly from the awkward positions required by tunnel work. By mid-October, he'd completed the horizontal passage and begun the exit shaft at the far end. This shaft angled upward from tunnel depth to ground level, emerging 23 feet from his cabin wall. He excavated it with the same care he'd used throughout, maintaining structural integrity while creating an opening large enough to pass through while carrying bundled wood. The walls throughout the entire tunnel were shaped with obsessive precision. He used a draw knife and scraping tools to smooth every surface, eliminating irregularities that would create weak points in the ice layer. Any bumps or depressions would cause uneven ice formation, and uneven ice would crack under stress. He spent the final 2 weeks of October doing nothing but smoothing and perfecting surfaces he'd already excavated. By early November, the tunnel was complete from an excavation standpoint, 23 feet of passage, with smooth-shaped walls showing the distinctive flat over curved cross-section. Now came the critical phase. He needed to transform this dirt tunnel into an ice-reinforced structure before the first major snow arrived. The temperature was dropping steadily. Winter was coming, and Henrik was ready. Henrik began the ice reinforcement process in early November when nighttime temperatures dropped consistently below freezing. His technique required patience and precision. Each evening after dark, he hauled buckets of water from the creek, warming them slightly by his fire to keep them liquid long enough to apply. He crawled through the tunnel with a bucket and his pine bough brush, painting thin layers of water onto the walls and ceiling. The water application had to be controlled carefully. Too much water would pool at the bottom and create uneven ice. Too little wouldn't build adequate thickness. He worked systematically, coating every surface with a layer thin enough to freeze uniformly overnight. By morning, the water had transformed into a glassy ice shell bonded directly to the dirt beneath. That evening, he repeated the process, adding another layer over the first. The ice built up gradually over 3 weeks. Each layer fused to the previous one, creating a laminated structure stronger than a single thick application would have been. The layers compressed microscopic air gaps and irregularities, producing ice that was dense and exceptionally hard. Henrik measured the thickness regularly with a marked stick. 4 inches on the ceiling where snow weight would be greatest, 3 inches on the walls where lateral pressure would dominate, 2 inches on the floor where he needed to maintain the curved crawling surface. By late November, the tunnel had transformed from a dirt passage into something that resembled the inside of a frozen pipe. The ice gleamed in lantern light, smooth and uniform. Henrik tested the structure by having Lars Nordquist walk back and forth above the tunnel route while Henrik lay inside listening. He heard nothing. No creaking, no cracking, no settling. The flat over curved design distributed Lars's weight so effectively that the tunnel registered no stress from a 180-pound man walking directly overhead. The exit shaft required special attention. Henrik built a wooden hatch at ground level using thick planks fitted together tightly. The hatch would sit beneath his relocated woodpile, hidden from casual observation. He cut the hatch to fit flush with the ground, leaving no obvious trace of the tunnel's existence. Inside the cabin, he constructed a similar hatch over the entrance shaft, using floor planks that matched the surrounding floor. He added leather gaskets around the edges to minimize heat loss when the hatch was closed. The final preparation involved relocating his woodpile. He built a platform of split logs over the exit shaft, leaving gaps that would allow him to lift the hatch from below. On this platform, he stacked his winter wood supply, all of it pre-split and organized into bundles. Each bundle contained 3 or 4 logs tied with cord, sized specifically to fit through the tunnel while leaving clearance. He could grab a bundle, crawl back through the passage, and emerge in his cabin without ever exposing himself to exterior conditions. The first significant snow fell on November 12th. Henrik's tunnel system was complete and ready. He just didn't know yet whether it would work when he truly needed it. Word of Henrik's construction project had spread through the scattered trapping community during autumn. Trappers traveling through the area stopped to see what he'd built, and most reacted with confusion or outright mockery. Duncan MacLeod arrived in late November and spent 20 minutes examining the tunnel entrance in Henrik's cabin floor before declaring the entire effort insane. He couldn't understand why anyone would spend months digging when the obvious solution was stacking more wood inside the cabin. William Crawford visited in early December and expressed concern that Henrik had lost his mind after Thomas's death. The ice tunnel seemed like the project of a man driven to irrational behavior by grief and obsession. Crawford pointed out that ice melted, that the tunnel would collapse by January, that Henrik would be trapped in his cabin when the whole structure failed and blocked both his entrance and exit. He suggested Henrik prepare a backup plan for when his elaborate system inevitably destroyed itself. Lars Nordquist was more diplomatic but equally skeptical. He acknowledged the impressive engineering and the obvious effort involved, but questioned whether the result justified the investment. Lars had survived 15 winters using conventional methods. He kept rope guidelines to his woodpile and stacked emergency supplies inside. The system worked adequately. Why spend 3 months of labor on a solution to a problem that already had perfectly functional answers? The common thread in all criticism centered on the ice itself. Everyone understood that ice was strong when frozen, but no one believed it could serve as a primary structural element for something as critical as a survival system. Ice cracked, ice melted during warm spells. Ice couldn't be trusted to maintain integrity through temperature fluctuations. Several trappers predicted that Henrik's first attempt to use the tunnel during a thaw would end with him trapped underground in a collapsing passage. Henrik didn't argue with his critics. He demonstrated the tunnel's functionality by crawling through it, emerging at his woodpile, retrieving a bundle of wood, and crawling back. The entire process took less than 4 minutes. But demonstrations during clear autumn weather failed to impress anyone. Of course, the tunnel worked in November when surface travel was easy anyway. The real test would come during a genuine blizzard, and the skeptics were confident that test would expose the tunnel as an expensive failure. Duncan started calling it Voss's Folly, within earshot of other trappers. The name spread quickly. By mid-December, most of the local trapping community referred to Henrik's tunnel with a mixture of amusement and pity. They saw it as evidence of what happened when grief drove a man to obsessive, impractical projects. Some predicted Henrik would abandon the tunnel after 1 winter and fill it in. Others suggested he'd be lucky if the collapse didn't damage his cabin's foundation. Henrik maintained his normal routine, checking trap lines and processing pelts. He kept minimal wood inside his cabin, relying entirely on his tunnel system for daily fuel needs. The tunnel worked flawlessly through December, but no one witnessed its operation during conditions that mattered. That would change in February. The storm system that moved down from Canada in early February of 1843 exceeded every trapper's experience in the region. Weather patterns suggested a major blizzard was coming, and the community made standard preparations. Trappers stocked their cabins with extra wood, securing enough interior fuel to last several days without venturing outside. Lars Nordquist filled half his cabin with stacked logs. Duncan MacLeod brought in enough wood to last a week if he rationed carefully. William Crawford reinforced his rope guideline system and positioned emergency supplies near his door. Henrik brought in 1 day's worth of wood. He trusted his tunnel completely and saw no reason to clutter his living space with fuel he could access any time, regardless of conditions. His neighbors heard about this and considered it further evidence of poor judgment. The tunnel might work during moderate weather, but betting your life on an ice passage during a serious storm seemed like dangerous foolishness. The blizzard arrived on February 9th and immediately proved itself extraordinary. Wind speeds reached what Henrik estimated was 50 miles per hour, possibly higher during gusts. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero. Snow fell so heavily that visibility vanished completely within minutes. The storm continued without pause for 4 consecutive days. Snow accumulated to 4 feet on level ground and much deeper where wind created drifts. The sound of the wind was a constant roar that made normal conversation inside cabins nearly impossible. Other trappers found themselves in desperate situations by the 3rd day. Lars Nordquist had stacked plenty of wood inside, but he hadn't anticipated the storm's duration. By day 3, he was burning furniture to supplement his dwindling supply. Duncan MacLeod attempted a wood retrieval on the 2nd day, confident his rope system would keep him safe. He made it to his woodpile, but disorientation and extreme cold nearly killed him anyway. He stumbled back with only 2 logs after 10 minutes of panic, suffering severe frostbite on both hands. William Crawford's rope guideline failed on the 3rd day. Ice accumulation made it brittle, and the weight combined with wind stress snapped it during the morning. He heard it break, knew his lifeline was gone, and spent 8 hours without fire before the storm briefly lessened enough for him to risk retrieving wood without the rope. He survived, but the experience left him shaken. Henrik used his tunnel 6 times during the 4-day storm. Each trip followed the same routine. He opened the floor hatch, descended into the tunnel, crawled 23 feet through darkness with only the smooth ice walls as guidance emerged beneath his woodpile, grabbed a bundle of pre-tied logs, and crawled back. The entire process took 3 to 4 minutes. His total exposure to exterior conditions during the entire blizzard was 0 seconds. He maintained a comfortable fire throughout, never rationed wood, never worried about supply. The tunnel showed no structural problems despite massive snow weight pressing down from above. The ice walls remained solid and stable. The storm ended on February 13th, leaving the Montana Territory under snow depths that wouldn't fully melt until April. Trappers emerged from their cabins to assess damage and check on neighbors, a frontier courtesy that had saved lives in previous winters. Lars Nordquist visited Henrik first, expecting to find him struggling with depleted supplies or damage from his experimental tunnel system. Instead, he found Henrik comfortable and well supplied, with a fire burning steadily and plenty of wood stacked inside. Lars asked directly how Henrik had managed so well. Henrik showed him the tunnel, opening the floor hatch and lighting a lantern to reveal the ice-reinforced passage below. Lars descended carefully and crawled through the entire length, emerging at the woodpile location. He examined the flat ceiling and curved floor, touched the 4-inch ice layer, and immediately understood what he was seeing. This wasn't luck or improvisation. This was engineered infrastructure that had performed exactly as designed under the worst possible conditions. Duncan MacLeod and William Crawford arrived later that day and heard the explanation. Both men examined the tunnel with hands still bandaged from frostbite and rope burns. The skepticism that had characterized their previous assessments vanished completely. Duncan stated it plainly. He had been wrong. This wasn't crazy. This was survival infrastructure that worked when everything else failed. William asked detailed questions about construction timeline, ice application technique, and structural principles. Henrik answered everything freely. Over the following weeks, trappers throughout the region came to see Henrik's tunnel and ask questions about replication. Henrik shared his technique without reservation. He explained the critical importance of the flat over curved cross-section, demonstrated his water application method, and emphasized that ice needed to be built up gradually in thin layers rather than applied all at once. He showed them his bundled wood system and explained how bundle size had to match tunnel dimensions. The spring and summer of 1843 saw 4 trappers begin construction of their own tunnel systems. Peter Steinman built the most sophisticated version, adding a ventilation shaft and extending his tunnel to include underground storage beyond just firewood. Lars Nordquist built a simpler design but followed Henrik's core principles carefully. His tunnel functioned flawlessly through the following winter. Not every attempt succeeded immediately. William Crawford tried to save time by using a square cross-section and rushing the ice application. His tunnel partially collapsed in December under heavy snow load. He rebuilt the following summer using proper technique, and his second tunnel served him for years. Over the next 5 years, tunnel systems became increasingly common in isolated camps throughout Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. The technique spread through demonstration and word of mouth, shared freely among men who faced similar challenges. Henrik continued trapping until 1848, then left for Oregon Territory, where he established a small farm. He married, lived quietly, and rarely discussed his mountain years. He died in 1871 at age 60. But across the Mountain West, his technique persisted. Historians estimate the innovation saved between 30 and 50 lives over 2 decades. Men who might have died like Thomas Garrett instead survived winters in comfort, protected by infrastructure built during autumn months. The lesson proved more durable than the man who discovered it.